Let's dive right in. I'd like to welcome on stage Treasury Secretary Stephen Mnuchin, and joining him is my colleague, the Hill's Editor-in-Chief, Bob Cusack. Bob, over to you.
Thanks, Joanna. Well, we timed this event quite well, I'd say.
You did indeed.
Yes. Well, Mr. Secretary, thanks for doing this. You met with Republican leaders on Capitol Hill about tax reform yesterday. Is the administration and Republican leaders on Capitol Hill, are you on the same page, and how confident are you that this can get done this year?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here this morning. It's a pleasure to be here with you. We've been meeting weekly with Chairman Brady and people at the Senate on tax reform. So since the president has been in office, this is something we've been working on very closely. I think, as you know, we have over 100 people in the tax department at Treasury who have been crunching numbers on lots of different things and lots of different ideas. We had a very successful meeting last night, and I think it's clear that the House, the Senate, the administration are all on the same page, that tax reform is a major priority to boost the economy, that the fundamental principles of making business tax competitive. We have a very uncompetitive system that's hindering the economy and jobs. We want to make business competitive, and we want to simplify the personal tax system, lower taxes, and create economic growth. So this is going to be the biggest tax cut and the largest tax reform in the history of our country, and we are committed to seeing this through.
Now, does the plan include transportation provisions, or is it just strictly tax reform?
This plan is just tax reform.
Okay. Does it include the House plan on border adjustment tax?
Well, let me just first say, we are going to release the details of the plan later today. So I'm not going to go through all the specifics with you. But I will tell you on the border adjusted tax, we've been talking to Chairman Brady and Speaker Ryan on this for a long period of time. And as I've said before, there's many aspects of it we like. There's certain things that we're concerned about. What we've discussed with them is we don't think it works in its current form, and we're going to continue to have discussions with them about revisions that they will consider. So that's where we are, and it's been very productive discussions with them.
Now, just between us.
Just between us, live TV, and a couple of hundred people here.
Can you say whether this will be legislative text or not, or just a plan?
Again, our objective is we're coming out with the principles today that are the plan, and we are going to work very closely with the House and Senate. We are meeting multiple times every week with them, both on the staff level and on the leadership level, to reach an agreement that will turn into a bill for the president to sign. So our objective is we will have a combined plan that comes out incorporating the principles that we've all agreed on.
It's been reported that the Trump plan will lower the corporate rate tax to 15%, as well as for pass-throughs. I'm not going to push on those specifics, but how do you pay for that? Are there significant offsets?
Well, again, let me just say I'm not going to go through all the specifics.
No, I know.
But since the 15% has been highly now in the press for the last couple of days, I will confirm that the business tax is going to be 15%. That is what the president said in the campaign. He thinks that's absolutely critical to drive growth. And what I'd say is people talk about pass-throughs. What we think is important is small business. And we are committed that small business owner-operators will have the benefit of the business rate. What this is not going to be is a loophole to let rich people who should be paying higher rates pay 15%. This is going to be for small businesses that drive the economy, and they will have the benefit of this.
Are you sticking with the so-called Mnuchin rule that there will be no absolute, along those lines, tax cut for the wealthy?
Well, that again, we'll get into that with the details of when we release the plan later today. But again, I would say, our objective is simplifying personal taxes. For most Americans, we think they should be able to do their taxes on a large postcard. And we're very pleased at the IRS with the number of returns that are coming in electronically. We think that's terrific, but the average American should have simple taxes. And for a large part of people, they won't be paying taxes. There will be personal exemptions, and for people who can't afford it, won't be paying taxes.
Initially, you said you wanted to get the bill to the president's desk by the August recess, but then health care didn't pass, and you've adjusted that to sometime this year. Just breaking that down a little bit, are you looking for the House at least to pass it by the August recess to show some movement before lawmakers get out of town?
Again, let me just say, the commitment that came out of the group last night is we want to move this as fast as we can. So that's what we're committed to do. We're committed to working, getting this thing done, getting everybody in the room, and getting this passed. So that's what you're going to see. We're working hard to get it done quickly. And I would say, in terms of economic growth, the president and I and others in the administration fundamentally think we can get to 3% sustained economic growth. That's very achievable. Tax reform is critical to it. Regulatory reform is critical to it. I think, as you know, we've been working very hard on the president's executive orders, and we are focused on creating economic growth.
And you've said that that growth would pay for the plan.
Absolutely.
Okay. The strategy for passing this bill, as you know, tax reform hasn't been done since 1986. That was a bipartisan bill.
30 years, it's about time.
Exactly. So now, are you viewing that as the model, or do you think, are there things in the plan that Democrats should like, or do you think that mostly Republicans are going to have to unite and carry this across the finish line?
Let me just say, we don't start out for what the model is. We start out with what we think should be passed. I'm hopeful that Democrats will work with us on this. This is about tax cuts that are good for the American people, and I hope they won't stand in the way of creating tax cuts for small business, for making business competitive, for simplifying personal taxes. So we're hopeful that it's bipartisan. But as you know, there's multiple ways of doing this, and the president is determined that we will have tax reform. Matter of fact, he called me at 7:30 this morning, and we went over plans for the day.
How involved has he been?
He's been very involved. He's been involved in the economic policies, as I said, for over the last year, as we did this on the campaign, and he's been very involved. We spent a long time with him yesterday in the Oval Office going through the final details of the plan.
The tax cuts of 2001 had an expiration date. Is the goal to make this permanent, or would you accept some temporary tax cuts?
Again, I would say the goal is to make it permanent, but there's lots of levers here, and if we have them for 10 years, that's better than nothing, but we'd like to have permanency to it. But those will be details that will be worked out.
President Trump had a clear message on the campaign trail, make America great again. Critics say the health care bill didn't really have a clear message. How will you sell this tax plan to the American public? Do you want the president to go on the road to sell it? But what will be the marketing message plan? Some people have said you should call it a jobs bill.
Well, let me be clear. This is about economic growth. That's what it's about. The difference between 1.6, 1.8, and 3% GDP is staggering. It's trillions of dollars of revenues. It's tons of jobs. This bill is about creating economic growth and jobs. And you're right, we should call this the 2017 Tax Reform for Economic Growth and Jobs to Make America Great Again. I just named it.
That's good. That's good. Now, there's obviously, this is Washington, so a lot of speculation that there's a plan B, that tax reform is so hard to do because it hasn't been done in 30 years, and that plan B would just be going to tax cuts at some point. How do you view, what is the success model for this? You want the whole thing, or would you accept, something down the road?
No, we're gonna do the whole thing. So we like hard challenges. That's why the president's here. He's taken on a hard challenge to make America great again, and he's determined to do it. As I said, this is the center and the core of his economic plan. And we've met with hundreds of business leaders since he's been in office. While we were on the campaign, we met with thousands of business leaders, small businesses, big businesses. Let me tell you, the one thing we heard more than anything else is people want tax reform, people want economic growth, and people want less regulations to put people back to work and make American jobs.
White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer said that the administration will be driving the train on tax reform. Is that true? Is the administration going to be the driving force with this plan that you're going to unveil this afternoon?
Well, I think it's clear that the administration is going to provide leadership, but this is going to be an effort working very closely with the House and Senate. and incorporating. But I think it was very important to the president that we put out the core principles. This is part of his big impact for the first 100 days. We've been working on this for a long time. And as I said, the core principles, we have fundamental agreement on what we're trying to do. And the details of tax reform are still to be worked out. But we're confident that we can work with the House and Senate to get this passed and to get something on the president's desk to sign that's going to create economic growth and jobs.
Have you reached out to any Democrats, centrists, perhaps, maybe like Joe Manchin, who supported your nomination, or do you see that coming down the road?
Again, I'm not going to comment on the specifics of who we've reached out to and who we haven't. You know, this is a process where we're now starting listening groups. Mm-hmm. So again, I think one of the things that's very unique about this president is he's willing to listen. We've had lots of people into the White House. We're going to have people from Congress at the White House. We're going to listen to what people have to say as we shape this plan. But the president's fundamental premise is we need to make American business competitive, and we need to simplify personal taxes.
People forget that you traveled extensively with the president on the campaign trail. How does that experience help you craft his economic policies?
Well, we've been working on this for the last year. The president did a major speech in Detroit on economic policy at the Economic Club. He did a major speech in New York at the Economic Club. I mean, this is an evolution. So, you know, the president has been talking about 15% taxes on business for a long period of time. He understands. He's a businessman who understands how to create economic growth. And he's very focused on it.
On the debt limit, what's the latest on when Congress must act to raise the debt limit, the debt ceiling?
The debt ceiling. So, you know, one of the fun parts of my job is I get to use these superhuman powers to manage the debt ceiling. So I would say in the near term, you know, there's nothing we're concerned about. We have the cash flow to manage the government. Matter of fact, we had one of the largest days ever of collecting tax receipts on April 18th. Mm-hmm. It was huge in both the absolute amount of money and the number of things that we transacted. So, you know, I'm comfortable into the summer that we're fine. Again, this is a discussion we're having with the House and Senate. Mm-hmm. I do think we need to raise the debt ceiling. There's no question about that. People agree. The full faith and credit of the U.S. government is the most important thing. And, you know, we're not going to let this become an issue.
Should the debt ceiling be paired with spending cuts, or would you prefer a clean debt hike?
You know, that to me is now you're getting into a technicality, okay?
It's a big technicality.
From my perspective, we're going to raise it, okay? So we're gonna raise it, and I think that, you know, this is something that both Democrats and Republicans understand. We've already spent the money. This is not the budget process, and we're going to raise it. How it's packaged and what it's part of, you know, I'll let the leadership in the House and Senate work with us on that.
You brought in a lot of revenue this month, but are you saying it's got to be done this year? It's got to be done in the fall.
The debt ceiling?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Now, and by the way, we're not going to do one of these wait till the last minute either. So we'll get the debt limit done in plenty of time, so there's no issues for the markets.
So there won't be any crisis like there usually is.
Correct.
Okay. Now, if Congress gets bogged down, would the administration consider lifting the debt ceiling via the 14th Amendment?
Again, I'm not, you know, we haven't had any discussions along those lines. And, you know, again, I'm not concerned that we're not going to get this passed.
Okay. How best to deal with the nation's debt problem? At some point, won't policymakers have to tackle entitlements like that was done in the Balanced Budget Act of 1997?
Well, let me just comment, you know, the growth of the debt from 10 trillion to 20 trillion under the last administration is highly concerning. And the absolute debt is something that we're well aware of. And again, going back to, I think the best way of dealing with this is economic growth. If you look at the ratio of debt to GDP, which is one of the things that we focus on in looking at economies around the world, we can shrink our debt to GDP through economic growth. And that is the critical number to look at.
You've said that the U.S. needs to get Fannie and Freddie out of government ownership. What's your plan to get the government out of housing And what would the effect be on mortgage rates?
Well, so, I've talked about this a bunch. This is something we've had many meetings on. Mm-hmm. Housing reform is a priority of mine. The existing system of having the Treasury have a gigantic line to Fannie and Freddie and operating these the way they are, we are determined to change that and not have that continue for the next 4 years. Again, I think the fundamental principles are we need to make sure we have proper housing finance in this country. We've had liquidity for the 30-year mortgage. That's been very important for the middle income in terms of being able to have home ownership. And home ownership and home building, as you know, is a very big part of the U.S. economy. So the number one issue is we want to make sure that we have proper liquidity in the housing markets. The other number one issue, because I wouldn't even call these number one and two in any particular order, I'll just call them the top two, is we can't put the taxpayers at risk. So we can't have a system where there's a bailout of housing finance. So we are looking for housing reform. We've spoken to different people. I think there's a lot of different good ideas. And, this is something we'll be working on in the second half of the year once we get further down tax reform to focus on our housing policy.
And are you talking to Dr. Ben Carson on those plans?
Absolutely. We're going to work very closely with him. And I think although the major focus is going to be on Fannie and Freddie, we are concerned with the growth of FHA loans. And we want to be very careful that in fixing Fannie and Freddie, we don't create a bigger problem at FHA. So this isn't going to be, whatever the solution is, it's not going to be we push down this and it pops up on the other side at FHA. So we're looking at this and working with HUD on comprehensive housing issues to make sure we have liquidity and we have safety.
On Dodd-Frank, there are different approaches in the House and Senate of how to revamp Dodd-Frank. Do you support Jeb Henscheling's bill, which is the subject of a hearing today? What's your timing on tackling that big issue, which was also one of the president's campaign promises?
So, again, I've had multiple conversations with Chairman Hensarling. We very much support the fact that he's launched this bill and he's focused on these issues. I think, as you know, the president signed several executive orders that we've been working on very closely. The first report will come out in the beginning of June. And what the president has asked us to do is look at not just Dodd-Frank, but even a much larger focus on regulatory reform. We'll be coming out with recommendations. Again, we've had over 20 different focus groups, in many cases 50 to 100 people at each one of these. We're taking an input from both banks, big and small, community banks, non-banks, regulators, non-finance companies, and we're going to come back with recommendations to the president. Some of the things we can do will be through regulatory changes. I think, as you know, we have the right to appoint several people at very critical regulatory agencies. We're very close with coming out with the president has approved someone to be the next vice chair of the Fed on regulatory reform. We'll be announcing that shortly. So some of this we think we can focus on through regulatory relief and getting the regulators working closer together. Some of these issues we'll focus on with executive orders, and some of these things will need changes to legislation, and we'll be working with Chairman Hensarling and others on that.
Some Republicans on Capitol Hill have called for a new IRS head, John Koskinen, who's held over from the Obama administration. Will a new IRS head be appointed?
Again, his term is over later in the year. We've had discussions with several people. We're very close to a decision. I would say he's working very closely with us on specific issues now, and we're looking forward to having a seamless transition. So this is one of the most important positions that we will be appointing, and again, we're close to making a final decision on that, and the president and I have been discussing it.
You're a New York guy, spent some time in L.A. What do you think about D.C., and what has been what's been surprising about the job?
You know, what's most surprising about the job is how people say that Washington is so different and how politics are so different. And I actually think a lot of the things I learned in business carry over to this job. That A lot of it is about consensus building and teamwork. It's about managing different constituencies. When you run a company, you have shareholders, you have a board of directors, you have employees, you have customers. I think what we understand in this administration brings a practical business approach. Again, we have an outreach to our customers. In many cases, again, on the economic side, it's either the personal side and listening to what people want, or small businesses or big businesses, working with our other constituencies in the House and Senate. So actually, my surprise is there's many skill sets that are transferable into this job. I'd also say it's it's one of the most interesting things I've ever done. It's no matter how many things I thought there were to do, there are more. So one of the areas, is as you look at this job, there's domestic finance, which I knew a lot about. There's international finance, which I had experience in. And there's a whole other aspect of this job in the Treasury, which is very important, what we call terrorist financing and intelligence. And as I like to say, I knew very little about this. I've literally had a speed course PhD in the last 90 days. But the sanctions programs and what we manage in Treasury are some of the most critical functions. I think you saw this week we came out with over 250 new sanctions on Syrian targets. We've been focused on sanctions on North Korea. We have the sanctions programs that we're managing both on Iran and on Russia. This is a very, very important component of national security. And I've been spending a lot of time on this since I've been in the job, particularly everything that's going on.
So is that about a third of your job?
It's probably been about more like 50%
Really?
of my job in terms of time. Because again, it's been some of the most important things we focused on, and they're very complicated issues. So whereas I came into the job with a lot of experience on financial reform, and when you talk about regulatory reform, I can be very efficient in doing this. I was not an expert on the Iranian nuclear arms deal.
Right. You're starting today with a tax reform plan. You want to get the bill done this year. It's going to be a topic that the media writes a lot about. And as you know, President Trump has been a big critic of the media. In the coverage that you've seen so far in the job, do you see a media bias, and how will you deal with the media going forward as you're trying to move this massive bill?
Well, again, I would just comment in, the president, has an ability to communicate directly with the American public. And even this morning, he tweeted on economic GDP. So I think it's great, He is focused on these issues, and he is communicating directly with the American public. Now, as far as all the media in this room, I'm sure you're going to completely give me perfect coverage of everything I say, so I won't have to comment on the fake news. But I'll leave it at that.
Well, Mr. Secretary, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Please thank the Secretary.
Thank you.